The room is quiet enough that small sounds feel amplified. Paper shifts. A sleeve brushes wood. Somewhere beyond the walls, a city breathes. Faint footsteps, distant traffic, a world continuing without urgency. Light enters through high windows and settles without drama. It does not spotlight. It simply exists. This is not a battlefield. It is a place where attention is trained to vanish. Before we move deeper into these shadows, take a moment to subscribe. Only if calm, quiet history feels like something you'll return to. Men sit at long tables, backs straight, expressions neutral. Not rigid, practiced. Their notebooks are thin. Their pencils are sharpened. Nothing about them suggests heroism. Nothing suggests defiance. They are learning how not to be seen. Here, the lesson is simple and repeated until it becomes instinct. The man who survives is the man who leaves no trace. You do not hear speeches about glory. There are no banners, no shouted slogans, no swelling music of destiny. Instead, there is subtraction. Identity reduced. Presence softened. The discipline of anonymity taught patiently, methodically, until it no longer feels like instruction but like gravity. This is the house of the Tiger Brigade, the Nakano School. It exists in the margins of the Imperial Japanese Army, deliberately uncelebrated. Its students are not trained to charge, to die visibly, or to be remembered. They are trained to wait, to endure, to deceive gently, convincingly, for as long as necessary. War, here, is not noise. It is patience. A man stands at the edge of the room, observing without comment. His posture is relaxed. His voice, when he speaks, carries no emotion. He does not inspire. He corrects. He explains that survival is victory, that capture is failure, that surrender does not exist as a concept worth discussing. The enemy, he says, will lie. The enemy will fabricate documents. The enemy will simulate peace. Therefore, peace itself must be treated with suspicion. These are not abstract ideas. They are practical tools. Students are taught how to read a landscape for absence rather than presence, how to move without leaving patterns, how to watch villages from a distance and understand routines without being detected. They are taught how to live inside a world that pretends nothing has changed. If you listen closely, you can hear the deeper lesson forming beneath the instruction. It is never spoken aloud, but it settles into the room all the same. Reality is negotiable. Orders are not. Among the men absorbing these lessons is Hiroo Onoda. He does not stand out. He is not brilliant, not visibly exceptional. His strength lies elsewhere, in attentiveness, in obedience, in the ability to accept contradiction without friction. When he writes, his handwriting is careful. When he listens, his face reveals nothing. He does not ask unnecessary questions. He understands that the absence of certainty is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The instructors explain that modern war is not fought at the front. It is fought behind it, after it, long after the enemy believes it is over. A soldier trained here is not expected to return quickly. He is expected to persist, to become indistinguishable from terrain, to absorb time without announcing himself. 30 years would not be discussed as a possibility, but it would not sound impossible either. Outside the compound, seasons continue their quiet rotation. Trees shed leaves. Streets fill and empty. None of it intrudes on the lessons being planted here. What is being shaped is not courage. It is endurance without witness. The men are told they may be alone. They may be cut off. They may receive no confirmation. In those moments, they are not to improvise. They are not to interpret. They are to wait. And if messages arrive that contradict their orders, messages printed on clean paper, messages dropped from the sky, messages spoken in familiar language, they are to remember this. A convincing lie always resembles the truth. You sense, even now, that something delicate is being sealed shut. A way of thinking that does not bend easily. A mind taught to distrust relief. A loyalty designed to outlast context itself. The room remains calm. The lesson ends without ceremony. No one applauds. The transfer does not feel momentous. There is no ceremony to mark it, no sense that anything irreversible is being set in motion. Orders are folded. Names are recorded. A destination is written once, then not spoken again. For Onoda, this is not departure. It is continuation. He is told to go to an island most maps treat as incidental, Lubang in the Philippines. He is told to disrupt, to observe, to prevent enemy use of airstrips and resources, and above all, he is told one thing that will matter more than any other instruction. Do not surrender. Do not die. Wait for orders. The phrasing is precise. It allows no expiration. At the time, it sounds like discipline. Later, it will sound like fate. The island receives him without acknowledgement. Jungle presses inward from every direction. Heat settles low and constant, thickening the air. Insects establish their quiet authority. Paths appear and disappear. Villages breathe at a rhythm that feels both slow and alert. You notice how little of this world announces itself. Sound travels poorly. Visibility shifts by the hour. Nothing holds still long enough to be trusted. It is a place where messages could easily be staged, where certainty would be dangerous. At first, the war is still present. Aircraft pass overhead. Distant gunfire punctuates the nights. Movement carries purpose. The instructions make sense. Then, gradually, the shape of the world begins to change. The war ends elsewhere. Not here, but everywhere else. Leaflets appear, dropped from planes. They announce surrender. They speak of peace. They promise safety. They carry familiar language, familiar formatting, signatures meant to reassure. But reassurance, Onoda has learned, is a weapon. You can feel the logic tighten around him, not suddenly, but layer by layer. Each message that contradicts his orders does not weaken them, it strengthens them. This is exactly what deception is supposed to look like. Clean paper, calm language, appeals to reason. The jungle does not change its behavior. The weather does not confirm peace. The orders have not been rescinded. So he waits. Years pass without being marked. Time here is measured in smaller things: ammunition conserved, clothing repaired, fires extinguished carefully. Food is taken when necessary. Movement remains deliberate. The island begins to move on without him. Fields return to use. Roads quiet. The rhythms of civilian life reassert themselves in fragments. People live. People forget. From a distance, this looks like peace. From inside the doctrine he carries, it looks like occupation adapting. You sense the quiet tension forming, not dramatic, not explosive, but enduring. A low, continuous pressure created by obedience without confirmation, by loyalty with no audience. This is not madness. It is coherence taken too far. Occasionally, shots are fired. Sometimes people are injured. Sometimes killed. These moments do not feel like battles. They feel like interruptions, proof to him that the war has not ended, only softened its shape. Later, these events will be counted. Approximately 30 lives lost over decades. Farmers, police, men trying to restore ordinary time. Here, they register only as consequence, not conclusion. The jungle absorbs everything. When decades pass beyond explanation, the world outside begins to speak of him differently. Not as a soldier, not as an enemy, but as something unresolved. A rumor, a figure lingering where history believes it has finished its work. And still he waits. Not for peace, not for forgiveness, for orders. An island that does not explain itself. The jungle closes in without intention. There is no moment when it announces confinement, no clear line where openness becomes enclosure. Green accumulates gradually, leaves overlapping leaves, vines threading between trunks, roots rising from the soil like slow questions. On the island of Lubang, this density is not hostile. It is indifferent. Rain arrives without warning and leaves without apology. The air thickens, loosens, thickens again. Sound behaves strangely here, sometimes swallowed, sometimes carried far beyond its source. A footstep can vanish. A voice can travel. You begin to understand why this place confuses certainty. For a man trained to disappear, the jungle does not feel like exile. It feels like alignment. Onoda and the small group under his command move as they were taught. Not quickly, not clumsily. They avoid paths. They learn the terrain by repetition, not by map. A hill is remembered by the way the wind bends around it. A stream by the way insects gather at dusk. Their days are quiet. Their nights quieter still. They do not talk much. Words here feel unnecessary. Every action has already been discussed elsewhere, long before the island was named. Fire is built carefully. Clothing is repaired with patience. Ammunition is counted, then counted again. The discipline holds. What you notice first is not fear, but order. A small, contained system operating within a much larger one that neither confirms nor contradicts it. At first, the logic is clean. Enemy forces are expected. Supplies are to be denied. The island's infrastructure is to be disrupted quietly, persistently, without revealing position. This is not combat as spectacle. It is erosion. The men watch villages from a distance. They observe patterns without interfering unless necessary. Crops appear and vanish. Livestock move and return. Ordinary life resumes around the edges of a war that is supposed to be ending. From above, from afar, this looks like peace returning. From inside the jungle, it looks like adaptation. Messages arrive sporadically. Aircraft pass overhead less often now. Leaflets fall, sometimes landing in streams, sometimes caught in branches, sometimes resting openly on the ground as if placed there deliberately. They speak of surrender, of capitulation, of an emperor's voice carried across the nation. But nothing in the jungle confirms this. The men read the leaflets carefully. They check phrasing. They compare ink. They look for inconsistencies, for the small betrayals of authorship they were trained to recognize. The problem is not that the messages are unconvincing. The problem is that they are too convincing. A sophisticated enemy would do this. A patient enemy would wait. So the men wait as well. Months stretch into years without ceremony. Shoes rot. Rifles require constant care. Food is taken when necessary, sometimes from abandoned stores, sometimes from fields worked by unseen hands. Occasionally, contact is made. A glimpse. A shouted warning. A shot fired more to assert presence than to kill. Later, these moments will be named, counted, argued over. Here they feel like friction, brief confirmations that the war still breathes, however quietly. You sense how time begins to change shape in this environment. Without dates, without news that can be trusted, duration loses meaning. The men age slowly, almost imperceptibly. Their bodies adapt. Their expectations narrow. The world becomes small enough to manage. At night, the jungle exhales. Insects take over the soundscape. Leaves shift. Water moves. Somewhere far off, a village light flickers, then disappears. You realize that the island has learned them as well. Their paths leave faint traces. Their presence bends routines. People avoid certain areas. Warnings pass without being written down. Peace here is not absence of violence. It is negotiation with memory, and still the orders hold. The shape of waiting. Waiting, at first, feels active. It has posture. It has intention. Each day begins with assessment, weather, ground, signs of movement. The men wake before light and move only when necessary. They conserve energy not because they are weak, but because endurance is a form of strength they were taught to respect. Onoda keeps notes in his head rather than on paper. Paper degrades. Memory, he believes, can be trained. The jungle becomes a calendar of sensations. Wet months and dry months. Periods when fruit appears, then vanishes. Times when the air carries smoke from distant burning, and times when even scent feels muted. Years pass without being acknowledged as such. As time stretches, certainty tightens rather than loosens. Every unfamiliar sound becomes suspect. Every unfamiliar pattern demands explanation. The doctrine learned at Nakano does not fade. It sharpens. Without new information to challenge it, belief folds inward, reinforcing itself. A plane drops newspapers once. The headlines are unfamiliar. The language is right, but the tone feels wrong. Too casual. Too settled. Onoda reads them carefully. Then he sets them aside. A war that ends politely is not a war he was trained to recognize. The group grows smaller. One man leaves, surrendering quietly. Another is killed in an encounter that is later described differently by those who witness it from the village side. Accounts diverge. Responsibility becomes diffuse. From the jungle, it feels like attrition. From the island, it feels like a wound that does not close. You sense the narrowing now, not just of numbers, but of reality itself. The fewer the voices, the easier it becomes to hold a single explanation. Onoda remains. He assumes command without ceremony. He does not celebrate survival. He does not mourn publicly. Emotion, like smoke, is something that gives away position. By the late 1950s, the world beyond Lubang has moved so far ahead that it no longer bothers to announce itself carefully. Search parties arrive occasionally. They call names. They leave food. They speak through loudspeakers, their voices echoing oddly through the trees. Onoda listens without responding. A man trained to deceive does not trust anyone who speaks plainly. You feel the tragedy of this not as drama, but as gravity, a system behaving exactly as designed, long after the designers are gone. Violence does not escalate. It repeats. Shots fired to warn. Crops burned to deny resources. Patrols avoided. Civilians killed in moments that feel less like decisions than like collisions. Two realities intersecting without a shared language. Later, these acts will be weighed and judged. Here, they pass without reflection. The jungle receives everything. By the time the 1960s arrive, a decade Onoda does not name, he is effectively alone. His uniform is patched. His rifle is maintained with almost ritual care. His routines have narrowed to the essentials: sleep, observation, movement, waiting. You sense now that the waiting has changed. It is no longer preparation for return. It is the structure of life itself. The orders are no longer something he is following. They are something he inhabits. The island continues to change around him. Roads improve. Radios appear in villages. Children grow into adults who have only heard stories of the man in the hills. Peace settles unevenly, like dust that never quite reaches the corners. And somewhere within the jungle, a single system remains intact, quietly resisting time. Not out of defiance, out of training. Doctrine after the war. By the time the outside world begins to forget him, the doctrine has fully replaced context. What remains on Lubang is no longer a soldier waiting for confirmation. It is a system continuing to function without oversight. Orders are no longer recalled as words spoken by a superior. They exist as structure, like gravity, like hunger, like the slow return of rain. This is what prolonged obedience becomes when there is no mechanism for release. The jungle no longer feels provisional. Early on, it had been a place of concealment, a temporary skin pulled over military intent. Now it is simply where life happens. Camps are rebuilt in familiar clearings. Routes are walked so often they no longer feel chosen. Each movement follows a pattern worn smooth by years of repetition. You can sense how certainty hardens here, not through fanaticism, but through familiarity. When the same explanation works every day, it stops feeling like belief and starts feeling like fact. The war continues because it must. If it did not, the waiting would have no meaning. The doctrine learned in Tokyo was designed for short-term isolation. Weeks, months, perhaps a year. What it did not account for was duration without interruption. There is no provision for boredom in the manuals. No guidance for doubt that arrives quietly, without drama. No instruction for how to recognize peace when peace does not behave like victory. So the mind does what systems always do under strain. It simplifies. Any evidence that contradicts the standing order becomes suspect by default. Leaflets are enemy tools. Search parties are intelligence operations. Familiar voices are recordings or impersonations. Appeals to reason are traps meant to flush him out. This is not paranoia in the cinematic sense. It is internal consistency taken to its limit. A trained deceiver expects deception everywhere. You notice how the logic loops without breaking. Each challenge is not a threat to the belief, but confirmation of its necessity. If the enemy goes to such lengths, then the mission must still matter. Reality does not fail him. It conforms. Time passes unevenly now. There are long stretches where nothing happens, days that pass in silence, punctuated only by rain and insects, and then moments of sudden contact, brief and confusing, leaving behind more questions than answers. A farmer appears unexpectedly. A patrol crosses a clearing. A warning shot echoes longer than intended. These encounters are not sought. They are endured. Later, the numbers will be tallied, dates assigned, responsibility debated. Here, they register only as disturbance, proof that the environment remains active, contested, unresolved. You sense how moral weight drains away through repetition, not because of cruelty, because of normalization. When an action is performed often enough within a closed system, it stops asking permission. It becomes procedure, a reflex. The jungle does not judge. The doctrine does not reflect. The war continues without witnesses. By now, decades have passed beyond what the mind can easily hold. The body has aged into its routines. Muscles remember paths even when the mind no longer marks them as routes. The island's peace has matured without him. Children born after the war grow up hearing about a figure who belongs to neither history nor rumor. Someone who does not surrender because surrender, to him, is not an option that exists. You feel the quiet danger of this moment, not in violence, but in permanence. A man shaped for disappearance has succeeded, and in doing so, has disappeared from time itself. A war without an audience. By the late 1960s, the island no longer recognizes the conflict as war. For the people of Lubang, the decades have done their work. Fields are cultivated again. Roads are repaired. Radios hum in the evenings, carrying voices from Manila, from elsewhere, from a world that has learned how to speak without remembering. The danger has not vanished. It has receded into habit. Farmers walk certain paths and avoid others. Patrols move with familiarity rather than urgency. Warnings are passed quietly, often without explanation. Children are told not to wander too far into the hills, not because of war, but because of something older, more diffuse, a presence that belongs to the landscape now. You sense how violence, when stretched thin across time, becomes environmental. For Onoda, the lack of reaction from the world confirms his isolation rather than challenging it. If the enemy has truly won, he reasons, they would not allow him to persist. If the war had truly ended, someone would come with authority that cannot be imitated. A commanding officer, a voice that carries not persuasion, but command. Until then, the absence of escalation is not peace. It is patience. Search efforts become sporadic. Governments lose interest. Files are closed and reopened, then closed again. Onoda shifts from threat to curiosity to inconvenience. Years pass where no one actively looks for him at all. This is the cruel efficiency of time. Not to erase violence, but to absorb it, to reduce it to something tolerable, manageable, ignorable. The island adapts. The jungle remains unchanged. Onoda's world continues to contract. He lives lightly now. Camps are smaller. Fires are rare. Food is taken with care, not out of restraint, but out of familiarity with scarcity. His uniform is more repair than fabric. His rifle remains functional through meticulous attention that borders on reverence. These objects are not symbols to him. They are continuity. When you listen closely to this period, you hear very little narrative motion. Days repeat. Seasons return. The outside world advances invisibly, like a tide that never quite reaches this shore. This is not suspense. it is suspension. Occasionally, voices drift up the hillsides, searchers calling his name, strangers shouting reassurances. Once, a man arrives with photographs, family members, old friends, scenes meant to reconnect him to time. Onoda studies them carefully. The images feel wrong, too composed, too intentional. The faces look like performances. He cannot imagine why the enemy would go to such lengths unless the deception mattered. He does not respond. A trained observer does not reveal himself when the picture feels staged. From the village perspective, these years feel different. The war, for them, has long since ended. What remains is intrusion, unpredictable, intermittent, and deeply personal. Lives are not shaped by ideology here, but by caution, by memory, by the knowledge that ordinary acts, farming, patrolling, walking at dusk, can still carry risk. The violence does not escalate. It lingers. You sense how this creates a quiet moral dissonance, a conflict without sides, without victory, without the clarity history usually demands. The jungle offers no resolution. By now, Onoda's patience has outlived the institutions that created it. The army that trained him no longer exists in its wartime form. The doctrines that shaped his thinking have been discarded, reinterpreted, or politely forgotten. But here, inside this closed system, nothing has changed. Orders do not age. Loyalty does not weaken. Time does not argue. And so the waiting continues, not as hope, not as defiance, but as structure. A war sustained by inertia alone. The world that kept moving. There comes a point where distance becomes absolute, not measured in miles or oceans, but in assumptions, the quiet understandings that bind a person to their time. By the early 1970s, the gap between Lubang and the world beyond it has widened beyond recognition. Japan has transformed. Cities rebuild, then rise. Factories hum. Neon lights replace blackout curtains. A generation grows up with no living memory of air raids or ration lines. The war does not feel unfinished there. It feels historical, something contained, archived, explained. Here, none of that reaches the jungle in a form that can be trusted. Onoda does not know the dates, but his body marks the years. Joints stiffen. Recovery slows. Small injuries linger longer than they once did. The discipline adapts, quietly compensating. Movements become more economical. Risks are avoided not out of fear, but calculation. You sense how endurance has replaced purpose. This is no longer a mission unfolding. It is a life being maintained. Occasionally, fragments of the outside world intrude. A transistor radio heard faintly from a village. Clothing styles that change between sightings. Machinery sounds that do not belong to agriculture. Each fragment is assessed, then filed away as anomaly. A trained observer does not overreact to novelty. What the doctrine never prepared him for was not deception, but irrelevance. There is no enemy adapting against him now. No intelligence operation escalating. No counter-strategy evolving. The world beyond Lubang is not watching closely enough to be clever. This is not a trap. It is neglect. You feel the quiet cruelty of this realization pressing in, though Onoda himself does not articulate it. A war cannot continue forever if no one else is participating. And yet, participation was never the condition. Orders were. In 1974, something changes, not abruptly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A man arrives on the island alone. Not a soldier. Not an official. A civilian. A traveler. He moves openly, without fear, without concealment. His name is Norio Suzuki. He does not carry weapons. He carries curiosity. Suzuki walks paths that others avoid. He calls out without caution. He speaks as though speaking is not dangerous. From the jungle, this behavior is baffling. An enemy does not move like this. An intelligence agent does not travel without cover. A decoy does not risk this much without backup. Onoda watches him carefully. You can sense the hesitation now, not doubt, but recalibration. A new variable entering a system long closed to innovation. Suzuki is not persuasive. He does not argue. He does not attempt to convince Onoda that the war is over. He simply states it. And waits. The encounter is not resolution. It is disturbance. Suzuki leaves, promising to return, not with documents, not with proof, but with authority. With the one thing Onoda has always said he would recognize. A commanding officer. The jungle absorbs this information quietly. For the first time in decades, something new has entered the system that does not fit neatly into doctrine. Something that does not demand reaction, only consideration. You sense the tension building now, not suspense, but fragility. A structure that has held for 30 years has finally been touched by something it was never designed to withstand. An ending. Authority re-enters the jungle. The waiting changes texture, not urgency. Onoda has never been trained for urgency, but attention, the kind that sharpens quietly, narrowing focus without announcing itself. Suzuki's promise does not feel like hope. Hope would be a risk. It feels like a condition to be monitored. The system does not collapse. It pauses. Weeks pass. The jungle resumes its patterns, but something subtle has shifted. Each sound is weighed differently now. Each movement is assessed with an added variable. Not threat, not deception, but possibility. You sense how dangerous this moment is, not because it threatens violence, but because it threatens coherence. For 30 years, the doctrine has functioned without contradiction. Now, it must either absorb a new input or fracture. When the men return, Suzuki, and with him an elderly figure in a faded uniform, there is no drama in their arrival. No announcements. No crowds. No triumph. Major Yoshimi Toneguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, reads the orders aloud. They are brief. They are unambiguous. They are authentic. The war has ended. All combat activity is to cease. Onoda is relieved of duty. You might expect relief here, or disbelief, or collapse. What arrives instead is stillness. Onoda listens. He does not argue. He does not weep. He does not resist. The authority he has waited for has finally appeared, and with it, release. The system does not shatter. It shuts down. You sense the cost of this moment not in emotion, but in weight. 30 years of vigilance have nowhere to go. 30 years of readiness find no outlet. The habits remain, but their reason evaporates. A life structured entirely around endurance is suddenly unnecessary. The jungle, indifferent as ever, watches him emerge. When Onoda walks out of the trees, time rushes toward him. Cameras, uniforms, voices, questions spoken too quickly, too casually. The world does not move at jungle pace. It does not pause to let silence catch up. He is still dressed for war. The war is no longer dressed for him. You sense how exposure feels violent in its own way, not physically, but temporally. A man steps out of 1944 into 1974 without transition. The air feels wrong. The light feels harsh. The narrative that forms around him is immediate and unstable. Some call him loyal. Some call him tragic. Some refuse to name the villagers he killed, or name them only in passing. The story simplifies him because complexity is uncomfortable. But inside, something else is happening. The discipline that sustained him has completed its task, and left nothing behind. When he returns to Japan, the disconnect becomes total. The country has moved on not angrily, not dismissively, but efficiently. The war is memory now, processed and archived. Onoda is received with ceremony, then confusion, then distance. He does not belong to the past they remember. He does not belong to the present they inhabit. You sense how exile can exist without geography. Later, he leaves again. Brazil offers space. Forests work that resembles continuity. A place where he can exist without explanation. It is not escape. It is alignment. A man shaped by disappearance finds a world that does not demand reintegration. What remains is not judgment. It is residue. A war that outlasted its purpose. A loyalty that exceeded its context. A patience that survived long enough to become burden. You feel the quiet truth settling now, not as lesson, but as presence. War does not always end when it is declared over. Sometimes it simply runs out of witnesses. What remains when the orders fall silent? The jungle on Lubang continues its work. Rain moves through the canopy in slow sheets. Leaves split, rot, and return to soil. Paths fade. New ones form. The island does not mark anniversaries. It does not distinguish between war and peace. It remembers only pressure and release. If you stand there now, nothing points to what happened. No monuments. No borders. Just land that has learned to absorb human intent and wait for it to pass. For Onoda, the war did not end with surrender papers or headlines. It ended unevenly. The discipline that had structured every hour of his life dissolved faster than the habits it had created. He was free, but freedom arrived without instructions, without rhythm, without a place to rest. Japan received him politely, then struggled to place him. The country had rebuilt itself by learning how to forget selectively. It remembered the war as tragedy, as warning, as history, not as something still actively lived inside a man standing before them. You sense how difficult it is to return when nothing has been waiting. Brazil offered him distance without judgment. There, among trees and open land, he could exist without explaining himself. He could work. He could keep routines. He could remain partially invisible, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a man who had learned how to live inside waiting. This was not resolution. It was accommodation. The villagers of Lubang carried something different. Their peace had been delayed, interrupted, thinned across decades. The violence they experienced did not fit cleanly into the categories history prefers. It was not a battle, not an occupation, not an accident. It was persistence without context. For them, the end of the war arrived long before Onoda emerged, and even then, it did not erase what had already settled into memory. Loss does not require ideology to endure. It only requires time. What lingers is not a verdict. It is a question. What happens when obedience outlives purpose? When loyalty survives the institution that demanded it? When a human system performs flawlessly and reveals its cost only after it finally stops? The Nakano school taught disappearance as survival. The jungle taught endurance without witnesses. Time taught neither mercy nor condemnation, only continuation. War is often remembered for its noise, explosions, movement, decisive moments. But some of its most enduring consequences unfold quietly, in places where nothing seems to be happening at all. A man waits. An island adapts. The world moves on. And when the waiting finally ends, what remains is not triumph or tragedy, but residue, habits without orders, memories without audience, silence without conclusion. You can almost hear it now. Wind moving through trees that no longer conceal anyone. Rain falling on ground that has learned how to forget footprints. A forest doing what it has always done, absorbing human certainty until it softens, then disappears. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.